Cameras didn't used to be so well-rounded. There was major compromises with whatever brand you went with, so you kind of had to pick your poison and then learn to work with it. If you were a GH4 user, you had awesome image quality, but a tiny sensor and limited ISO capabilities. If it was Fujifilm, there wasn't a lot of lenses available and there was limited video features. If you were Canon, you didn't even have mirrorless cameras, and Sony's early lineup had a ton of weird issues, but they were also the coolest. If you had an alpha camera and you were running around with it, people noticed, and nothing was cooler than the A7S II. It feels like this is when mirrorless cameras started to feel like real professional tools and not toys. You would see these things all over the place, and even though the specs aren't impressive now, they definitely used to be. Just shooting 4K felt cutting edge in 2015. If you're down to hang out for a bit, I figured we would revisit the A7S II today, because it really is an interesting camera. First things first, the A7S II came out when we still had record limits, so unfortunately you can only shoot for 30 minutes at a time. When I was shooting weddings, this was the worst thing ever. You had to keep track of how long each camera had been recording and run around and cycle recordings. It was horrible. You can externally record, but that's kind of a drag. If you're gonna pick one of these up, the record limit is definitely something to keep in mind. We're using good old NPF 50s instead of NPZ 100s, so you can optimistically expect like an hour of battery life, but probably less. Not the end of the world, and you can trickle extra battery from the micro USB port if you need to. But since there's already a record limit, chances are the best option is just to stock up on batteries, but the good news is they are super cheap. Next issue is a product of the times, I guess. The I/O selection on the A7S II is cheeks. There's 3.5mm in and out, micro USB, and micro HDMI, which is better than nothing, I guess. You can trickle charge on the micro USB, which is nice in a pinch. The micro HDMI is unfortunate, especially since this monitor isn't super bright, and filmmakers might want to add an external one. Fourth hurdle, this is an old sensor and processor, which has two main downsides. First is the readout speed, which is really bad. 25 milliseconds bad. Even in regular handheld footage, you'll see some skewing, so we really need to be careful of that. The other thing is that this was before 10-bit cameras were commonplace, so the highest quality footage you can get is 100 megabits per second 4K 8-bit 420. A lot of filmmakers back in the day wouldn't even shoot S-Log3 because it would spread the files a little bit too thin and instead go for something a little bit more gentle like S-Log2 or maybe one of the Cine Gammas, but I think I'm going to shoot S-Log3 just to see how bad it is. There's a lot of other things to complain about, like the screen dimming when recording in 4K, or the weirdly placed record button, contrast-based autofocus, or the single card slot. With all this stuff stacked up, it would seem like the A7S II is pretty confusing. How was this camera able to rule the prosumer filmmaking world for so many years, shoot theatrical releases, and firmly establish Sony as the bar for other cameras to be compared to? This isn't really a story about whether or not the A7S II is still a great camera in 2024, 10 years later after its release. It's more of a story about how far cameras have actually come. When this thing was out there in the world being used professionally, there was really only one other mirrorless camera being used like that, and it was the GH4, which had come out a year before. So we were used to shooting 4K only on micro four thirds size sensors, and then this guy comes along and gives us the opportunity to shoot 4K with IBIS and a full log curve. We didn't even care about dynamic range or readout, just the opportunity to put whatever lens we wanted on a camera like this and shoot large format and it be 4K was insane. This was when the mass exodus from DSLRs to mirrorless reached full speed, when people started adapting their favorite vintage lenses onto their digital cameras, and when professional and consumer cameras started to affect each other's gravity. So yeah, there's some pretty big usability shortcomings here, but the biggest question is if a sensor this old is still able to produce a competitive image. One thing to keep in mind is this camera is discontinued, so the only way to pick one up is used. Prices are hovering in the neighborhood of $600 to $700 USD, so let's see what that can buy us. Okay, so skin tones out of Sony cameras from this time period are supposed to be really bad, but let's see what's actually going on. We're gonna grab the sauce and put it on here, which is just my standard node tree. I'm gonna turn off the film emulation, texture, and density. And then as you can see, this is pretty well overexposed, which I did do on purpose, and that can help with the noise a little bit. I'm gonna go to my color correction node, go to HDR, and bring the exposure down. And then just a little bit of contrast work. This is biting a little hard. And there you go. I don't know what I was expecting really, but this is not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. This skin tone looks fine. There is some blotchiness that is not perfect. And if we zoom in over here and kind of zoom in, this is just a white wall. There's like this pink splotchiness. More than likely that's from the 8-bit footage, and unfortunately there's no way to get around that even if we externally record. The colors that are existing in this shot I don't think are too bad. I'm going to turn density back on, I'm going to turn grain on, I'm going to turn texture on, and I'm going to turn the film emulation on. And maybe bump this down to like 0.2. It's looking a little bit green from this film emulation, so maybe I would turn the tint up just a little wee bit. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and do option 1, go to the next shot, command 1 to paste that grade on there. I'm gonna zero out our contrast and color correction, and then I'm gonna go and redo it, bring the exposure way down, and then again, we do have to do a little bit of contrast work because this is a little bitey. I wanna bring up the shadows, make it a little bit smoother. And I don't think this looks too bad. There is one thing I'm noticing here right off the bat, and that's these tight details that are in the leaves and the trees. It's getting a little bit crunchy. It's not able to resolve all that detail. All of these shots that I'm gonna show, I recorded in 1080p because it was just way too hard to record with the screen being dimmed in 4K. And also, I think the 1080p looks pretty good. From what I can tell, it is being oversampled from 4K, which is good news. The only reason I'm saying that is because it looks really well detailed, and also the readout doesn't change. It doesn't get any faster, which would mean that if the field of view is staying the same, then more than likely it's being oversampled. We got all the detail on the sky, we held on all that. There's detail down here where this boat is. That's not even that noisy. It's pretty impressive. I think the main issue here is not with dynamic range, it's more with the lack of data and this 8-bit crunchiness. Last shot, this one was recorded at 12,800 ISO. I'm gonna paste the grade and then zero out everything. This one looks pretty well exposed, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of contrast work, and then we can look at the noise pattern. Although, what's interesting is that this was recorded at 12,800, like I said, and there's a visible noise here, but it is not super distracting, and it's more granular than I thought it would be. I can't verify for sure if there's a dual native ISO in this camera. There might just be some kind of weird noise reduction that kicks in to a higher extent at 12,800. There's obviously some noise reduction here, certainly seen much, much worse, and especially being shot at an ISO that high, this is a really, really, really clean shot. So noise pattern isn't the worst, the internal color science isn't the worst. Unfortunately, the lack of data is a little bit limiting. I think with some really careful shooting, you can still get some really amazing images. And color science only ever really looks bad in the context of a better looking color science right next to it. So if you're able to work with this footage and learn these colors and get them to look really nice, no one's gonna know the difference between this or anything else. It's more about learning your color grading software to get the look that you want, and even more important than that, it's composing and lighting your shots. The real party trick of the A7S II and really the whole A7S series is the low light sensitivity. Between the lower pixel density and some noise reduction trickery, you can shoot in some seriously dark environments. This is probably a huge reason for the popularity of the A7S II in the documentary and wedding spheres. Being able to shoot in less than ideal lighting situations is just one less thing you need to worry about. Ergonomics are fine. I'm really glad Sony has opted for bigger grips in the newer models. This one is a little small, but at least there's a lot of buttons to customize. People like to complain about these old menus, which I always thought was kind of weird. You can learn this menu top to bottom in like 10 minutes. It really isn't that bad. A really cool thing is the inclusion of IBIS. Being able to use basically whatever lens you want and not worrying about keeping it stable really is a beautiful thing. What I think is so interesting is how bad I wanted one of these when they first came out. The original launch price was over $3,000 USD, and people were glad to pay that for the value you got in this little camera body. This thing used to rule the world, but today it feels mostly forgotten about. Sony has refined their cameras every single year, and the current lineup is so much better in basically every single way. So what's the point? The point is that you're a filmmaker, and camera bodies are in one day and out the other, so your style should transcend whatever brand you're known for using. I used to think that all the top creators using A7S IIs were awesome because they used A7S IIs, and that their value as an artist was tied to whatever their chosen camera was. I used to just drool over this thing and hope that I had the money to pick one up, but turns out it doesn't have magical powers. Except the low light sensitivity, that actually is magic. My practical thesis is the A7S II is a really cool used camera to buy. If you can pick one up for $600, you're buying a large format sensor that shoots 4K and has IBIS inside, so you can use whatever lens you want, and that's pretty cool. Yeah, you'll have to work around some of the usability quirks, but what's the fun in a perfect camera anyway? I don't think it's the end of the world to have to learn how to make 8-bit images look good. It'll probably make you a better camera operator at the end of the day anyway. My sappy thesis is that cameras allow us to develop and share a craft, but I don't think they should dictate who we are as filmmakers. There's so much more to this than button placement and pixels. Hey, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.